In today's video, we'll be talking about Stella Adler and creative imagination. Hello, theater kids, and welcome back. My name is Heather, and welcome back to this series for Theater 5363, Acting Theory in America. Today, we're going to be talking about someone that I've always found interesting since I learned about her in undergrad, and that is Stella Adler, actress and teacher. Now, we're going to get into a lot of information about her acting method and about the Stella Adler Conservatory, but before we get started, let's get our source on. Our first source is going to be The Great Acting Teachers and Their Methods by Richard Brestoff. We're going to be looking at the chapter that he has on Stella Adler, and we'll also be taking a look at Method Acting Reconsidered, edited by David Krasner, his chapter on the Stella Adler Conservatory. So now that we're ready, curtain up and let's begin. So this chapter starts off by talking a little bit about Stella Adler's background, specifically about her parents, Jacob and Sarah Adler, who I'd actually heard about when I was researching something earlier for an education class. And I found that really interesting because ever since I learned about Stella Adler in undergrad when I was taking modern and contemporary theater, she was someone that I was particularly interested in learning about. So she was born in 1902 in New York City, and she started acting around the age of 4. She was soon known by everyone for her dedication and her energy, which would definitely serve her well when she became a teacher later in her career. She trained some of the most esteemed actors in film and in theater. So Adler, just like Strasberg, also attended Boleslavsky's Lab Theater when she was in her 20s. At this point, she had already made a name for herself on stage. She was fairly well known. She was known to be a very serious actress, and she really dedicated herself to things that were artistic pursuits. She was one of the original members of the group theater, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and she was one of the more experienced members at the time. But she was really questioning Strasberg's use of the system. As you remember, Strasberg was the one who was training the actors to perform. And after studying with Stanislavski in Paris by herself in the 1930s, she returned to the group with this new information and started training her fellow actors. And by 1949, she had left the group theater and started her own acting studio. And by the time she passed in 1992, she owned conservatories on both sides of the country, one in New York City and one in Los Angeles. Now, the main difference between Adler's acting method and Strasberg's was in Strasberg, you focus on emotional recall, and in Adler's method, she wanted you to focus on imagination, circumstances, and action. If an actor cannot pull up an appropriate emotion for a character, then she would have the actor remember a parallel experience to remember the playable actions from that memory. So if you talk about something similar that your character is talking about, then how does your voice sound? How do you move? How do you gesture? Do you change your pace and your rate? So instead of pulling out an emotional memory, you can use your imagination to fill in the appropriate tone and delivery, and that way you can use your experience without having to rely on specific emotions. Now, just like Stanislavski and Strasberg, Adler believed that you had to start with relaxation, but she also focused on muscular challenges, so you would focus your movement on a specific part of your body. And she also believed it was the actor's job to de-fictionalize the fiction. So the actor needed to believe in the world of the play and exist within the world of the play. Now, the emotion of a character needed to come from the given circumstances of the character. Actors needed to know where, when, what, and who in a scene to make it come to life, and to keep in mind that the circumstances for the characters are always going to be changing. She also taught that the characters' circumstances are going to guide their action. Actions are what we do. Circumstances tell us why we do them, and once we know why we do them, then we know how to do them. So instead of using Stanislavski's through line of action, she used the term overall action. So the activities and actions of a character have to be justified to support the overall action. So while Strasberg focused on the emotion of the actor, Adler wanted to focus on the creation of a character. So you have to understand the circumstances of the play. You have to understand the circumstances for the character, and then that would lead to truthful behavior. So once a behavior is found, you find the voice of a character, and then you can focus on truth instead of trying to play a cliche or a stereotype. So just some of my takeaways from this, I was not aware that she actually attended the lab theater, and so that was interesting to me. She and Strasberg had the same training, although I presume she stayed for the second year of training while Strasberg did not. So they were both very well versed in the original Stanislavski system of acting, but they had very different reactions to it. Strasberg based his method on emotional recall, and Adler rejected that because she found it ineffective. And I really appreciated the examples that the chapter gave for each part of the creative imagination technique. It made it a lot easier to understand than other texts I've read. The description of using parallel experiences to inform how you deliver your dialogue was really interesting. It made me really re-examine the thought process behind it. And finally, I was really interested to notice that a lot of Adler's method relies on understanding the circumstances, including your preceding incidents. What has happened to your character before they walked onto this stage? And I've used this technique before to break down difficult or complex characters. It makes them a lot easier to understand and to stage. And I really like the chapter's final point that different methods are going to work for different actors, or even for the same actor playing different roles. So we are constantly having to learn and adjust, and it's good to know that different techniques like this are out there to help guide us to where we need to be. So in this essay, Mark Hammer talks about Stella Adler and the Stella Adler Conservatory, which has two locations on each side of the country. So Adler, according to Hammer, considered herself an actress first, teacher second, and a theorist a very distant third. However, even after being trained by the Stanislavski, she never considered herself to be a master. This is way different from anything that Strasberg or Meissner ever said. They considered themselves to be authorities. So Adler liked to surround herself with teachers from different backgrounds, different training, and especially people that had learned training elsewhere. Her teaching method didn't want to have one answer for all problems. She treated each case individually for something that would speak to that particular actor. A lot of times, if she would contradict herself, she would address it with the explanation that she was an actress and therefore she contained multitudes. And if she wasn't able to really clearly define something, she would just say, you really had to be there. So in short, she taught a lot by example and not by hard and fast rules. The Adler Conservatory still operates even after her death as a continuation of her mission to teach the next generation of actors. The conservatory contains a museum to Stella. It has artifacts from her early days in the Yiddish theater, her time with the group theater. There's a bust of Stanislavski, her mentor, and after her passing, her grandson took over the conservatory to revamp the curriculum and to change the staff. And it's now a part of the New York University Bachelor of Fine Arts program. The first year requires a course in the Adler technique, which consists of a lot of exercises to create natural techniques for feeling at home on stage. The students are also exposed to humanistic studies and communal responsibilities to reinforce that the self is part of acting, but the self has to include the world around you. This is a huge statement. This is one that I feel is overlooked a lot in the acting curriculum. Actors need to be in touch with the world around them to use your talents and skills for the greater good. And I like that the program helps see the idea of drama as a humanistic discipline. The Adler Conservatory also has channels for students to volunteer in various venues around New York City. They also have the Harold Clurman Lecture Series, which includes guests in the field. They do readings, they do concerts. The speakers are chosen based on their work outside of the world of theater, and they're encouraged to share why they have chosen a life in art. Classes at the conservatory focus on the reasoning behind theater, and they reinforce artistic identity as a connection to the social world. This is a real monument that I feel to Stella's legacy. She felt deeply that theater was a means to reach the world and to advocate for change. Hammer also points out that to categorize her approach as being bound to realism is to do her a complete disservice. When she was trained, realism was kind of at its peak thanks to the Moscow Art Theater, and she did advocate for realism in her approach, but she placed an equal amount on the use of imagination. She believed that The emphasis on emotional memory, as we saw in Strasbourg, it focused too much on the memory when you need to be using imagination, and too much on emotional when you have more than just an emotional connection with your character. She was convinced that drama deals with doing, and feeling comes from the doing. This is a part of her approach that I particularly like. There's times when I can't figure out the emotional connection for a role, and my emotion for the scene is not enough, but I can imagine, have I been in a similar circumstance, and that helps me better connect to what the character is doing. In the Adler Conservatory, you are expected to be well versed in Shakespeare, which makes total sense. Diction is evaluated on how well it conveys a thought or idea, not by how good you sound. The Adler technique, very much like Stanislavski, use speech as an instrument of action and not just a way to convey information with no connection to the character. Your movement is evaluated on efficiency and economy rather than how graceful you are. Students are also trained in improvisation as part of the curriculum, which makes sense because improvisation does require a lot of imagination. And Adler respects the text of each play as a means to empower the actor. She was often heard shouting, "The play is not in the words, it is in you." And I've heard her say this on archival videos on several occasions. It feels really inspiring when you hear her say it. I always try to teach that there's a reason for the text beyond the words on the page. It's our job to give it meaning and life. So Stella Adler really represented the spirit of the work of Stanislavski, and it pushed the narrative that the actor bears a lot of responsibility to create art and to use it to make the world around them better. Stella Adler definitely contained multitudes, and those multitudes live on through the students that study her work. So finally, let's talk a little bit just about how I feel about Stella Adler. As I mentioned, I first learned about her as an undergrad, and I found her absolutely fascinating. I started looking up archival videos of her and just listening to the way that she speaks and just how impassioned she was as an actress and as a teacher. She really truly believed in her art form, and that was always so inspiring to watch. It was I just learned so much just by watching the way that she taught other people. So that's something that's always kind of resonated with me. I've also kind of really enjoyed a lot of the Adler technique of using creative imagination because as someone who is autistic, a lot of times it is difficult for me to identify or quantify an emotion and figure out what the appropriate emotion would be for a particular scene. However, using the Adler technique of finding a similar circumstance and remembering how that felt within my body, not necessarily the emotion, but how it felt within my body, delivery of words, action, things like that. Sometimes that is a lot easier for me to connect with than trying to connect with a specific emotional memory. So I found that the Adler technique is one thing that tends to work for me in a lot of circumstances. Don't get me wrong, I do use Strasbourg's technique on some other occasions depending on the show and the character, but I found that overall, the majority of times I work better with creative imagination than I do with emotional recall. Now, the downside of that is that this is not something that is going to work for every actor because it relies a lot on past experience, not necessarily past emotion, because we've all experienced emotions before, but we may not have experienced the same kind of circumstances as a character. And so it may be hard to find a similar parallel circumstance that we can draw back on in order to create the character for ourselves. And so I feel that the Adler technique works a lot more with older or more experienced actors just because you have more life experience to draw on. This is not something that I feel would work really well with younger and inexperienced actors just because they don't have that life experience. And so while the part of filling in things with imaginative details, filling in some of the circumstances and the ideas for the surroundings for the character, just using your imagination for that, that works really well for younger actors just because the younger you are, usually the more vivid imagination you have. And so that portion of it works really well. But then trying to find a parallel circumstance may not work as well because you just haven't had those life experiences yet. So as you can see, just like with Strasbourg's, there are some pros and cons to using this approach. Again, depending on the actor and what type of character they're trying to build. So there you go. Those are my readings and the thoughts on my readings about Stella Adler and creative imagination. I hope you found this informative and helpful. Why don't you let me know what you thought down in the comments below. Also, make sure that you stick around for the rest of this series, where we're going to be taking a look at some more master teachers in the art of theater. But for now, we will say goodbye and